Hello group. In this LabVIEW video, I'm going to show you the basics of setting up a DAC assistant, and this will be one of the only videos that you have to be in the lab environment, room 18, with a DAC hardware turned on at your computer. So that's going to be the content of this video, and so if you are not in lab room 18 with a DAC hardware unit at your station, you may want to view this video later or take some notes this time, and then when you have a chance, try it out in the lab. So what I have is an empty block diagram, and I'm going to show you the way I set up DAC units every time I set up a program to acquire measurements. So my functions toolbar by default usually tries to get me into the programming area, but we're actually going to be working on the express area. Now, your toolbar might look like this, slightly abridged of the total set of tools. So the double arrows opens all of the tools available, and express allows me to set up my block diagram. I'm going to start with an execution control while loop with button. Oh gosh, I'm not sure how big I made that. Careful dragging your box. Sometimes it makes it bigger than you intend. There we go. Simple while loop. And back on the Express toolbar again, I have this input palette. And under input, I can enter a DAC assistant. So my DAC assistant is a tool that is going to help me set up to acquire signals. Now you'll notice you can both acquire and generate signals. We are not going to get into this, but know that that's something that's a possibility later on. We're going to acquire analog input most of the time, but there are also possibilities for acquiring counter and digital inputs. Under analog, you'll see a large range of types of data that we can collect. When we get to Lab 2, we can collect strain directly. When we get to Lab 3, we can collect temperature directly. We can measure voltage and current and resistance, which are just electrical properties that we might be interested in. And we're going to start with a simple voltage. Now I should add that I have already turned on my DAC hardware. So at this point, you might need to pause the video. When you click on voltage, if nothing comes up here, no devices are loaded onto your computer. So take a look at your hardware, and we'll talk about this as well in class. Make sure it's turned on and there's a light active. If it's not turning on, make sure it's plugged in. If it is on and it's still not here, make sure that it's plugged into a USB port on your computer. And then finally, I think any other issues might have to go through some support. So DAC modules are numbered, and you'll notice the numbers on the physical system. We're going to use the 92, oh, my 9205 is missing. That's interesting. So at this point, I guess I will collect data through the 9211. And now you choose inputs: analog input 0, analog input 1, analog input 2, etc. If you have the 9205, I would have chosen one of those ports, so now I have to debug my unit. Choose an analog input, and then we finish. And you might be thinking, I don't have anything wired yet. How can I possibly be done? This is the tool that tells me how to wire. So forgive me as I try to fit this into our window. Okay, so I'll be scrolling around a little bit. At the top here is a testing area. If I run a test, I will collect whatever's on that analog input. I don't have anything wired to my hardware right now, so if I hit run, I get a whole bunch of noise or nothing at all. Looks like I'm getting nothing at all, and that's fine. Oh, because of my acquisition mode. Oh, there we go. I'm running, and I'm getting just whatever kind of noise sits on the input port when it's not actively experiencing a variable. If I select connection diagram, what comes up is a detailed figure showing me where to put my positive and negative signal relative to the DAC. So I chose the 9211. Look at your hardware. You can see how the 9211 is set up. It's saying if I put my plus on 0 and my minus on 1, I will measure the delta between these in the DAC unit. Now if I come back here, there are some other settings I might want to change. Every time I set up my DAC assistant in this class, I want one sample on demand. What that means is every time the program gets to my DAC assistant, it takes a single sample and it moves on. Other things I might want to change. My input range. This is measuring from 80 millivolts to negative 80 millivolts. I, on different modules, might be able to choose from differential. I can actually choose RSC, which is with respect to ground, and that allows me to measure a single voltage with respect to the internal ground on the NI DAC module. For Lab 1, you'll notice you're measuring a single signal positive voltage. You measure it with respect to ground, so you would change it here to RSC. What else to note? The other thing I want to point out is that I can rename these, and if I have multiple measurements in a single DAC assistant, which I can do, so I could come back here and say, I also want to measure a second voltage. Where's a second voltage? And I'll just do the next input. So now I don't know what they are. Maybe this one is ultrasonic. And maybe the second voltage, maybe I've got a pressure sensor somewhere. And so I'm going to rename this to be pressure V. So, and that's a good point. Keeping it as ultrasonic V reminds me it's voltage. Pressure tells me what it is. And details tell me what device I chose and what physical channel I chose. Now I'm going to go ahead and just accept this. Like I mentioned, this isn't exactly quite right for Lab 1. This is just an example DAC setup. For Lab 1, I want to use the 9205 and any inputs that you want just for my ultrasonic transducer. So I click OK, and it might take a moment. You can't see it. There it is. There's my please wait. It's building all of the background of the sub-VI that's going to sample your hardware and bring the data back in the proper units every cycle. Okay. So then what we have, if you hover over each of these, it tells you what each input is. The stop, I'm going to always wire my stop to my stop button. I'm having a hard time getting it here. Here it is. So I want my stop button to stop my DAC assistant as well as my program. I'm just going to quick clean up here. There we go. And now I'm going to make an indicator, so I can right-click here and create a numeric indicator. And now I can demonstrate for you the second, actually third or fourth now, best practice for DAC assistance. So my first best practice, it's always in a while loop with a stop button. My second instruction is to set up your DAC assistant for what you're trying to collect. My third is to wire stop to your stop button. And then notice this big blue bulky wire. It's not our nice pretty orange wires from before. I need to convert this, and actually let me take out the second signal so that we only have one. I'm just going to X out the pressure and just have my ultrasonic. Click OK so it rebuilds the DAC assistant. It always brings this back. We just wait. Now I want to convert my single data point that's coming out with all sorts of extra information, date, time. And I want to get just the number to appear in this box. So I'm going to right click, insert from this all palettes, not signal manipulation, but all palettes. I'm going to come to numeric and conversion. Now I am pretty nested here, so let me do it again. I right clicked, insert, everything, numeric, conversion. I want to turn this into a value, and I'm going to use a single precision float, and it takes all of this information and it turns it into a single And the final step here, and I think I can show you what I mean if I run. Let me get this into the window. So if I was to run this right now, I can't show you very well because I don't have a value plugged in. This usually is a pretty noisy data point. So something that you might also need to do is slow down your program. And I tend to just use a wait in the corner of my program. I can right click on the input and create a constant that waits for, say, 500 milliseconds between loops. So setting up a DAC assistant, your first step is to put in your while loop typically. In your DAC assistant, your next steps are, let me put in a new one just to recap. So we choose what we're doing, acquiring analog voltage, choose how we're doing it, and then we change the settings in our DAC assistant to be appropriate to the task, including one sample, RSC or differential as appropriate, adding as many as we want, changing the names if we need to, and clicking OK. So that is today's video on setting up a DAC assistant in LabVIEW.